And welcome to the University of Tasmania's Island of Ideas online public lecture series. My name's Dr. Matt Killingsworth. I'm the Head of Politics and International Relations here at the University of Tasmania, and I'm delighted to be hosting this evening's US presidential election roundtable. To begin our evening, as a reflection of this institution's recognition of the deep history and culture of the island, the University of Tasmania wishes to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which our roundtable is taking place, the Palawa peoples, and acknowledge their elders past, present, and emerging. The Island of Ideas is a program designed to keep the ideas flowing during this period when we're unable to host public live events. And each year the university presents hundreds of lectures, forums, seminars, and workshops free of charge for our students, alumni, and the wider community. And these are an important part of the university's role. That's why we're hosting forums such as this evening. So a few housekeeping notes before I introduce you to this evening's panelists. Your microphone, camera, chat function, and raised hand function have all been disabled, so our speakers can't be interrupted. However, we do encourage you to ask questions. This can be done at any time by typing them into the Q&A function, which you'll see on your screens. And I will do my very best to answer as many of them as possible this evening. And finally, this lecture has also been recorded, so you'll have access to it later on YouTube. Now, this evening's event is being co-hosted by the University of Tasmania and the AIIA's Tasmanian branch, so I thank them for their support for this evening's event. To discuss why the upcoming presidential election might be the most important in living memory, we have a panel of which I'm going to ask probing questions of this evening. Our first panelist is John Barron, who hosts the Drum and Planet America on ABC TV. John is the author of 3 books, including Vote for Me, about the American presidential election process, and is a research associate at the US Study Centre at the University of Sydney. Our second speaker this evening is Professor Alison Dagnes. Ali's a professor of political science at Shippensburg University in Pennsylvania and is the author of Super Mad at Everything All the Time, Political Media and Our National Anger, Politics on Demand, the Effects of 24-Hour News on American Politics, and A Conservative Walks into a Bar. And our third panelist this evening is Dr. Gorana Grgic, who is jointly appointed lecturer at the Department of Government and International Relations and the United States Study Centre, both at the University of Sydney. So I thank all of them for being here tonight to help us sort of work through all of the issues that we're going to discuss. I've proposed an initial question for all of our panelists this evening, and I've asked them, and I'll go to them individually now. I've asked them to consider what might be the defining characteristics of President Trump's first term, and in turn, what might be the defining characteristics of the campaign up to date. So we've just had both of the conventions. I don't think it's too far to suggest that this isn't politics as normal in the United States. So I might go to John Barron first and ask him, John, your defining characteristic of President Trump's first term, and in turn, your defining characteristic of the campaign up to date.
Thanks, Matt, and hi, everyone. Great to be with you for this UTAS event and with 2 terrific academics in the field in Ali and Gorana, as well as Matt. Look, I would say, if I was going to generalise, Matt, I'd say that the first 3.5 years of the Trump administration, like the 18 months of the Trump presidential candidacy from 2015 onwards, has really been just one tearing up of the rule book after another. It was in late 2015 that then Republican perceived establishment frontrunner Jeb Bush turned to Donald Trump on a debate stage and said, now, Donald, you can't insult your way to the presidency of the United States. Well, of course, he was wrong about that. That's exactly what Donald Trump did by embarking on the most unrelentingly negative campaign we have seen in presidential political history. He went further than even, say, the likes of Lee Atwater did on behalf of George H.W. Bush against Michael Dukakis in 1988. It really was a scorched earth campaign and quite harrowing for many of the participants. But Donald Trump had to do that because he had to reverse what Barack Obama had achieved over the previous 8 years, which was to change the electoral landscape of the United States, to motivate young people, people of color in particular, to vote often for the first time. Instead, Donald Trump angered older white voters, many of whom hadn't voted since Ronald Reagan, to come out and vote again, and also to turn some older white working class, previously unionized voters in the Rust Belt of the United States to tap into their anger and frustration at what they saw as America changing on their watch. So anger and I guess also that factor of tearing up the rule book, saying things, doing things, being prepared to go places that no other presidential candidate has gone before. And since then, of course, continuing, not becoming typically presidential, continuing exactly as he was in this strange form of authenticity that he has. He is entirely consistent, including massive breaches of the Hatch Act at the convention last week, using the White House as a massive prop for his re-election. But of course, it worked in 2016, and it's not impossible, even with the pandemic and the economic headwinds, that it could work again.
John, on that point that you make about 2016 and the way that he campaigned, I think it's really important to remember that the Republican Party's review of 2012 was that they had to increasingly reach out to minorities. They had to increasingly reach out to women. And yet the 2016 playbook in just jettisoned that entirely. And we saw the success of Trump's and in some lesser extent running against sort of the Republican Party's wisdom in 2016.
Yeah, and that, I guess, was one of the rule books, literally, that Donald Trump tore up, ending the kind of Latino outreach that candidates like Jeb Bush, Marco Rubio, and to a lesser extent, Ted Cruz promised, instead going for an anti-immigrant, populist and xenophobe. So, you know, he looked at the demographics on paper and said, well, there's a country that's still more than 70% white. I can win with basically white voters, maybe 10% of African Americans, few more African American men than women. But he put together a coalition that a lot of people still believe is a very short-term coalition that will really evaporate with Trump and may not even be replicable this year. It may be that it was one and done as far as that Trump coalition is concerned, because it wasn't a Republican coalition as such that he managed to assemble. And there are real doubts as to whether he can do it again now.
Excellent, thanks. So, Ali, the same question for you of sort of what for you has been the defining characteristic of the last 3.5 years, and in turn the campaign to date.
Well, first, I want to thank you for having me. This is really a treat. John has said it so beautifully and stolen the words out of my mouth. I'm just going to build on what he said, because that rule book tearing, when you asked, what is the defining characteristic, I had put down unnecessarily combative. And that just, I think, has been the defining feature of Donald Trump, perhaps in his entire life, because that's the way that he was when he was a real estate developer, and that has translated into his political persona as well. And there are reasons for that. I'm sure we all have sort of delved into some of the pop psychology of this, but this combative nature of his John's absolutely right. I mean, he really has efforted to reverse everything that Obama has done. And in addition to that, he also has succeeded, I think, in tearing down the Republican Party. The conventions were proof of that, where for the first time, I think, in the Republican Party's existence, there was no platform that the party put forward. There was no set of policy beliefs that they agreed upon. And instead, what they put forward was a memo that said, we support Donald Trump's vision of America. And that was, to many of us who've been watching this closely, jaw-dropping, because what this really has solidified is less of a partisan directive and more of a cult of personality. And he has done that by tapping into that anger that John mentioned, and the frustration that so apparently so many Americans have had of feeling that the establishment of the Republican Party has left them behind. And so the big fight right now in the Republican Party is a fight between the establishment folks who have just sort of absconded and said, okay, we will stand with you, and those who've said, no, we have to fight you in order to have a set of principles. And so, you know, John is again correct that short-term coalition, I fear that it has longer roots because that anger is so palpable, and he has successfully stirred it up in everyone. And so what we see now is an increasingly combative Republican Party and Democratic Party. You know, I did write a book that's called Super Mad at Everything All the Time. And this is perhaps karmic payback for writing a book that's called that. But in truth, everyone is seemingly furious and also exhausted. And what that has really done is suppressed a certain amount of the American public who have just thrown up their hands and said, I don't want anything more to do with this. And so I just look at it with a little bit of a broken heart as a political scientist.
When you look upon that, the sort of the modus operandi of that, were you in some respects surprised at the way that both conventions played out recently, with a degree of sort of the Republican National Convention sort of looked like 2016 Redux in some degree, and both you and John have said that coalition might not be existing anymore, or that political ploy might not be a viable path to the White House anymore. Were you surprised at sort of, and then in turn, I guess, the way that the Democratic Convention made such an overt and clear reach out to disaffected Republicans?
It was, both were striking, right? For the Democrats first, their idea of, we have a very big tent. Not only are we more diverse, but also our tent includes Republicans, and it's okay for you to stand with us. And the key takeaway from that convention was empathy. We have empathy. We're nice. He's not nice. And so there was a lot of finger pointing. And, you know, let's be really honest here. Donald Trump is the epicenter of everything. He has become the focal point of all of our politics. And so the Democratic Convention was about Donald Trump and how mean he was. And then the Republican Convention, which had a jarring lack of actual Republicans there, meaning the last living Republican president, the last living Republican vice president, the last two nominees for the Republican candidacy, the last three speakers of the House who were Republican. I mean, it was just it was sort of stunning in how few of the party elders were there, which is another break from norms, but another indication of how everything revolves around Trump. And so given that focal point, it was not surprising, but that doesn't mean it wasn't still sort of jarring to see.
Gorana, for you, what's your defining characteristics? And again, I know we're sort of in very broad brushstrokes here. The defining characteristic of the last 4 years, and in turn, what did you take out of the conventions as perhaps a pointer for the last 2 months of the campaign?
There I am, unmuting myself. Thank you, Matt, and thank you to University of Tasmania for having me with a great panel. I think it's going to be a boring night if we keep on agreeing, but I will have to agree with Ali and John and just echo some of what they said around this, obviously, America First in action and what that had meant over the past 4 years. We have seen, certainly in the conventions, a bit of a split screen America, where the Republican National Convention was almost running in kind of parallel reality to what the Democratic Convention was, at least in terms of painting this, I would say, a dissonant message, where in one moment it's all about, you know, the pandemic that has been successfully dealt with and the worst times behind us. There's no economic depression or any of the civil unrest on the streets, but at the same time using some of these things to actually try to go after the Democratic nominee and the party in general. But in terms of the defining moments, I guess, because both Ali and John talked about the domestic policies, I would just like us to maybe switch to the foreign policy realm and think about the way how America First has looked like, not in terms of just the way that it was obviously articulated in terms, well, better or worse, in terms of these motives that they mentioned around cultural dispossession, appeal to the kind of middle America, around also issues of economic and structural inequalities that might ring through to some of the areas that have suffered the most as a result of the industrialization or outsourcing of jobs. But in terms of foreign policy and the way that 2016 was really a kind of referendum on the post-Cold War consensus on what US foreign policy would be like, the kind of idea of internationalism, or if you want to go as far back as post-World War II era, but then how 2020 now is all about the great successes of the Trump presidency on the foreign policy front, which frankly don't match up with the reality. So we've seen, and John has already mentioned that Trump has been really good at tearing things up. Certainly on the foreign policy front, he has managed to really undermine what we normally refer to the liberal international order, kind of the institutions that governed it, either as organizations or regimes of various sorts in terms of security, trade policy, etc. But he really hasn't been able to put anything in its place. If you don't include things like USMCA, kind of the revamped NAFTA, but no major deals on that front. And we've really seen over the past year, especially this kind of scramble to try to get something out, some sort of big breakthrough deal. And in that sort of context, we can take a look at, some of the recent announcements, such as the kind of rapprochement and normalization of relations between, say, Israel and the UAE. But really, it's what has been most striking is the way that, Donald Trump has had, I would argue, a foreign policy doctrine, one that has really been based on this kind of transactionalism or transactional realism. Everything has been governed based on a zero-sum logic. It really has been the kind of world of America First there, either through, economic nationalism, protectionism, or outright unilateralism that goes at expense of allies, and also just this sort of lack of any sort of moral imperative in US foreign policy that we know US has not always fulfilled, but certainly the rhetoric has been devoid of any sort of idea of American exceptionalism.
So there's so much to think about there, and I was immediately sort of thinking about the departure from NATO, for example. I really like your idea about the US no longer being sort of the bedrock of the liberal international order, which to a degree has been problematic since the end of the Second World War, and there's been issues with it. Is there, do you think then, electoral sense in the way, in lots of ways, that Joe Biden is talking about a return to, I guess, what is normalcy with respects to the US role? And he's talking about, his first one is that he will ensure that the United States is back as a member of the Paris Agreement, for starters, the climate change agreement, making noises already about being tougher on Russia, for example, which I assume would mean reintegrating with NATO. Is this electorally smart for Joe Biden?
Well, Joe Biden was basically, since the first day of Trump's presidency, putting out a message kind of, we'll be back. And, he would go to these Munich security conferences and try to reassure the transatlantic community, for instance, that, this is just a kind of passing thing. Trump is an aberration rather than just kind of a symptom of something else going on there. And I would say that the idea idea that, you know, US can be back in a sort of way that maybe it was present back in 2016, while, you know, it's a nice thought, I would say the world has moved on, and it's not just about the United States, it's also obviously about other powers, big and small, rising, redefining what, you know, their role in the world is, and so on. So, I mean, we can pick any given theater, whether it's the transatlantic area or the kind of greater Middle East, or for that matter, this part of the world, Indo-Pacific, Asia-Pacific, or just Asia, whatever you want to call it. But there have been a lot of things that have been happening over the past 4 years, and I think a lot of the allies, but also just rivals and competitors are making their calculations based on the past 4 years. Allies will certainly need to be reassured that they can take America for its word, but also the fact that they have also been thinking and talking about becoming more autonomous, simply because the power relations in the international system are no longer what they were, say, in the so-called era of unipolarity. That was the kind of first long decade after the end of the Cold War, or for that matter, what they were just 10 years ago. And it's not just about, you know, again, the point is that it's not just about US and its influence, but the fact that there are others that are bidding for their space in the sun, and that are willing to exert their influence, either because they want to challenge the United States in that sort of role as the hegemon, or are simply revisionist powers on their own terms in their own regions.
At the risk of turning our entire Q&A into a sort of discussion on President Trump, there's a degree to which we've got to give the audience what they want. I sense they want to hear more about President Trump, but I'm taken by both Ali and John's sort of agreement on tearing up the rules. And it seems to me that this president from very early on has sort of struggled to reconcile the difference between the idea of public office and private advancement. And we've seen that in a variety of spaces. For both of you, and Ali, I might come to you first and then come back to you, John. What does this mean for, and I know it's probably a bit early it's very early to do Trump retrospectives, but how damaging has this been to those established US institutions that have been held so very dear? And in fact, the US holds up as an exemplar to other countries.
It's done tremendous damage. You're right. The destruction, because what is lost in, Gorana used a great expression, transactional. That's kind of how he has operated in every realm, right? President Trump's a very transactional leader. He sees everything in financial terms, which I guess makes a certain amount of sense since he has never served in any kind of public service role before. He's always been a capitalist and a real estate developer, and money is first and foremost in his mind, which is why some of the decisions that don't make sense for the country, he views in terms of how much is it costing us. You know, everything goes back to this, it's expensive, they're not paying their own way. It's, you know, this kind of, we're gonna look like suckers if we keep paying for things. And the fact that he does not value public service or see how his role is as the leader of the country instead of the leader of his base, that has done tremendous damage to, first and foremost, I think, I mean, we could spend, you know, forever talking about the different institutions of government, but to me, it really is the destruction of trust that the American people have, because in order to convince his supporters that he is correct, he does it on the back of the idea that the system of government is incorrect or corrupt, filled with deep state actors who are out to get them. And it's that kind of destruction that allows for the destruction of everything else. Because when the American public stops trusting in their elected officials, then that makes a lot of room for somebody else to come in and say, as he did during the 2016 campaign, I alone can fix it. And that is factually incorrect. It goes against everything that's, in the Madisonian conception of little r, little d, Republican democracy. And that is increasingly tricky to try and fix, because trying to fix the public's trust is no small matter when somebody has come in and really just sort of set fire to all of it. So that, I think, is the largest thing.
You get extra cool points for mentioning Madison tonight as well, for what it's worth. So, Ali,
Thank you very much.
John, on sort of the effect on institutions of this administration?
It's very tempting to try and psychoanalyze Donald Trump. Every president of the United States is, to an extent, a extreme or dysfunctional personality type. It's not a normal thing for somebody to decide of all 330 million Americans, 50 governors, 100 senators, 435 members of Congress, I alone should be the most powerful politician on the planet. So we can fairly say that it attracts a fairly unique ego type. And there are a lot of profiles that we can see of, cases of the absent father in the case of Barack Obama and Bill Clinton, sort of, being told by a mother who put a lot of weight in, I want this child to succeed, having them feel good about themselves. It kind of got out of control. And so they sort of said, oh, I'm going to become president then, In Donald Trump's case, though, and we have from his niece Mary Trump's book in the last month or so, a suggestion that he was basically made into a sociopath by his father, Fred Sr. I'm not sure about those, how useful those kind of analyses are. The most useful that I've heard was simply a description that was given to me when Peter Baker of the New York Times, their chief Washington White House correspondent, was out here about 2 years ago, and he said, the key to understanding Donald Trump is the word shameless. And once you see everything he does through the prism of the word shameless, you understand what Donald Trump is doing, whether it is in business, whether it is in giving a speech with notional outreach to African Americans, while at the same time sending a very loud dog whistle to white nationalists who are opposing Black Lives Matter protests, whether it is his interactions with women who are not one of his numerous wives at any particular time. So there's the shamelessness is kind of the defining feature with Trump. So transactional, I think, is a very good way to look at him. I would add to that shameless. Trump feels no remorse. He doesn't have the slight pang when he knows that he's stretching the truth or telling an outright lie. He has no, if you put him on a polygraph, I'm sure there would be not a flicker when he tells one of the more than 2,000 false and misleading things that the Washington Post fact checkers have pinged him on so far. So transactional and shameless. And if that is his approach to institutions, well, of course, why would he care about the fact that no previous president has conducted a nomination speech from the South Lawn of the White House? Why would he care that he is in fact having the Secret Service pay him to protect him from would-be assassins when they rent rooms at Bedminster or at Mar-a-Lago or Trump National or in Trump Tower itself? That he is profiting from the proximity of Trump Hotel down the road from the White House, that he is doing all of these things, including zoning applications in Washington, D.C. that he is manipulating to benefit his family. You sort of think, well, why would somebody in their mid-70s be doing this? Is it about the money? Is it about the power? Is it about some sort of, profound existential void in his psyche that he still can't fill up? There are lots of explanations for it, but ultimately, so many of the things that Donald Trump has done have been shameless, but have also shown that the conventions, the protocols, the Marquess of Queensberry rules that up until now politicians have abided by have been very easily dispensed with. And the big question is, of course, will we ever go back, or will we see a succession of Trumps? Will we go back to, just whoever's next in the Republican production line of presidential candidates? Typically it was, whoever came second last time gets to be first this time. So I guess that would be Ted Cruz next time around. Or are we going to see a more Trumpy version? And that'll tell us to an extent, how lasting these changes have been and whether any of these rule books can be sticky taped back together.
Matt, can I add on?
Of course you can, Ellie, yeah.
I'm so sorry. I'm sorry to interrupt. John is so correct. And I just want to add on that there was a New York Times piece over the weekend that said that the president actually felt a tremendous amount of glee in breaking the rules because nobody was stopping him from doing so. And so in addition to all of this, because you're right, he is shameless. He also, there's an element, you know, it's trolling, right? They call it trolling the libs. The fact that he can make the establishment or the media or Democrats just so angry apparently adds a tremendous amount of happiness to him. And so I guess we're gonna have to see, as John said, if the next person has that kind of attitude. Sorry for interrupting.
No, not at all, not at all. Returning to the conventions and the various platforms that both parties offered, it seems that the Democrats are running on a platform that's fairly obvious, that you can't trust the president with 4 more years, considering the calamity that he's got us in with both his response to COVID-19, the economy, Black Lives Matter, and Joe Biden also mentioned his complete and lack of acknowledgement of the climate crisis as well. And they were sort of the 4 key points that he made. And then we juxtapose that with the Republican National Convention, which was a forget about the last 6 months, have a look at what we did prior to that. And we deserve another chance to get us out of the mess in some respects that we got us into. For the 3 of you, which of these at the moment appears more either electorally sound or can be sort of more, can be successful when we're looking at the current environment in the United States? Gorana, if you don't mind going first.
Sure. Well, there's that Reagan dictum that, you know, ask yourself, are you better off than you were 4 years ago? And this is apparently a question that then makes you not, you know, really focus on yourself or the opponent, but really pose this sort of question and make it a choice, really. And this is the Republican tactic now to basically try to make the pandemic as a sort of isolated kind of exogenous event, as we would say in social sciences, something that President Trump had no control over. This is why he was so adamant from day one, after some flip-flopping, granted, to pin the blame really on China, to make this the Chinese virus, as he calls it. And if it wasn't for that, obviously, we would have seen, you know, the economy still going strong and everything humming along as it was before. And this is basically the message that they're putting forward to an extent. But then also in the kind of other track of that strategy, there is obviously ask yourself where you want to kind of, where do you want to be in terms of potential, you know, disturbances or unrest that basically Trump and GOP that's kind of coming along for a ride want to portray it in terms of the Black Lives Matter protests and so on, and basically portraying Trump as the only one that can rein things in, even though all of these things are happening as he's still the president and obviously part of this problem, given that there hasn't been an adequate response to things that have been happening under his presidency. And what's more, he has in a lot of ways just exacerbated a lot of these issues. But so Trump is trying to make this as a choice. Biden is making it more of a referendum. It's basically 4 years of Trump. Look at it not just from the perspective of the pandemic, but also look at it in totality. Where is it that, you know, the country is in terms of just social relations in general? It's standing in the world basically in a much more dire state than it was. And again, it's not just, I mean, it's a lot about the pandemic and the ensuing economic crisis, but obviously it goes as far back as Joe Biden puts it. For him, it was Charlottesville. It was basically, you know, there are good people on both sides. It's much more about basically kind of reacting to what has been a reaction originally to where America is going, the kind of minority majority country to kind of a progressive country, given that we've had these 8 years of Obama with multiple kind of strides in terms of various issues that have to do just with societal relations, and basically this being kind of an issue that's put out there to the voters.
I completely empathise with Joe Biden on that one on Charlottesville. That was a real game changer for me in lots of ways in my observations of US politics over the years too. Ali, to that question of sort of strategy, I also wouldn't mind adding is there importance of Kamala Harris as Joe Biden's running mate as well?
Of course, yes, there definitely is. Playing, I think, to both camps, right? I mean, so if the Democrats predicated their entire platform around, you know, you can't trust President Trump because of COVID, because of Black Lives Matter, climate change, all the stuff that Gorana was beautifully articulated, and the Republican platform was, you know, forget about the last 6 months. This really is playing into the white identity grievance politics that Trump sort of roots himself in. And so as he does, I mean, it really toggles between dog whistle and foghorn, but as he either says, you know, hey, the cities under Democrat control are violent, and these people are going to come out to the suburbs, and, you know, it's just, you know, arguably like Black people are violent and white people are the victims here. If that message resonates, then having a woman of color on the ticket is going to be sort of an identifying, do you see, this is what they stand for over there, the Democrats, that's what they stand for. Meanwhile, having Kamala Harris in this very historic position for the Democrats is saying, okay, this is what we stand for. And so then I think the question gets to who will vote, because we are so, it is surprising how evenly split we are in this country. And if you look at the voting data for 2012 and 2016, there's a drop off in the number of Democrats who actually went to the polls, which is why Donald Trump was able to win with fewer votes than Mitt Romney was able to lose, and in 2012. And so as a result, you know, what you end up having is sort of who is able to shake the trees and get all of their voters out. And President Trump's campaign is predicated on a base only approach, hoping that he can thread that needle that John was referring to earlier, and that he can get those folks out. He can get those people to the polls on election day, and that if he just makes the other side like throw up their hands and go, okay, well, never mind, that he will win again. So I think that it's every nuance is important here. And he's not some grand strategist, but I think that he's playing to America's worst impulses. And when I mean, it showed in 2016, when you do that, you can win.
John, did you want to add to Gorana and Ali's analysis of sort of the electoral strategies?
The big problem, of course, with Donald Trump's electoral strategy of everything was great until it wasn't with coronavirus, and it's all China's fault, and not accepting any responsibility for either the health or economic implications of his clear mishandling of the coronavirus pandemic, his not listening to expert advice, not shutting down early enough, costing literally tens of thousands of American lives as a result, and extending the period of economic damage as a result of that. It's worth remembering, because of events such as Charlottesville, which Gorana mentioned, Donald Trump was already an historically unpopular president before coronavirus came along and ruined everything. he had the worst first midterm result of any incumbent president in decades. It was a wipeout. He was the only president who in the first 3 years in office never got above 50% in the Gallup poll. In fact, he only got above 45% in the Gallup poll after he was impeached in February this year. Donald Trump was not doing well. But of course, in 2016, he was able to win with 46% of the vote. 2.5 million fewer votes than Hillary Clinton got, but he got them in the right place. His margin of victory in 2016, of course, was a total of 78,000 votes combined in Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. And as Ali rightly points out, he won states like Michigan with fewer votes than Mitt Romney had lost Michigan 4 years earlier. So he depressed the vote. And of course, the other big thing was significant third-party candidacies by Libertarian Gary Johnson and Greens Jill Stein. Well, this year, there is not a strong Libertarian candidate. There's not a similarly high-profile Greens candidate. So pretty much voters are seeing this as a choice between 1, Donald Trump, 2, Joe Biden, and 3, not voting at all, of course, non-compulsory voting, demotivated, disillusioned, left or right or centre or independent. They can just choose to stay at home. So obviously the key here is what is the electorate that is going to vote by mail, in person, whatever way they can try and do it without endangering their health in the 2 months from this week that we have until the polls close on the 3rd of November. That's the big issue. So the strategies are all aimed at suppressing the other people's vote, trying to win some over if you can, but in a highly polarized environment, really winning somebody from one side to the other is very, very difficult indeed. There's not a lot of evidence that suggests there are that many swing voters. But if you can get some Republicans, some old school establishment Republicans that held their nose and voted for Donald Trump in 2016, but would really rather see him go away this year, well, that's what the outreach with the likes of John Kasich and Colin Powell were all about at the Democratic Convention 2 weeks ago. If you want to try and just, win over 1-2% of African-American males who have a deeper streak of social conservatism than I think many Australians realise. African-American men often still church-going, often still have very conservative values when it comes to things like same-sex marriage, even down to gender equality, pay equality issues. So not surprising that some of those abandoned Obama when Hillary Clinton came along. They didn't like the idea of a white woman becoming their boss. We're only talking about small numbers here, but it can, when 78,000 votes can determine an election, we are potentially talking about, just on the margins here. So Donald Trump reaching out to voters that may not want to vote for him at the RNC last week. And also, of course, reassuring white suburban voters that by seeing a lot of black and brown faces at the Republican convention, that disproves this narrative that Republicans and Trump are a bunch of racists. Because look, we have black people too. They're all speaking at our convention. But my sense was that was really more about the the McCloskeys, the gun-toting St. Louis residents, than it actually was for significant numbers of African Americans to be won over to Donald Trump's cause.
So, John, just to follow up on that, because the pandemic has obviously created a unique voting environment in the United States, and it seems to me that it can go one of two ways here. That the pandemic creates new opportunities to avoid voter suppression, traditionally the way that had been done in the past. And you're right, Donald Trump has been explicit about that. In fact, he acknowledged when less people vote, Republicans win. But there's also the fear, obviously, on the left at the moment that mail-in voting and what is happening with the US Postal Service at the moment is just a new way of voter suppression in a pandemic. What's your view on the opportunities that the pandemic creates to either overcome voter suppression or, in fact, make it worse?
It's a big unknown, Matt, and it may be the $64,000 question for this November, because traditionally there's a bunch of research around this question of the competing efforts to, on the one hand, suppress the vote of the other side, and on your behalf to get out your vote, GOTV. All the things you can do to mobilize your base, whether it is to punch hot button issues, whether it's left-wing or right-wing causes. you push those buttons and you get people motivated, passionate, angry enough to vote, or you disillusion the other side, a pox on both their houses. In 2016, the double haters, the people that hated both Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, some of them voted for Gary Johnson and Jill Stein, but more of them actually voted for Donald Trump. And whether that was a late split because of the recurrence of the issue of Hillary Clinton's emails with the Jim Comey letter 11 days out from the election, or whether they were shy Trump voters who were always going to tip that way, we will never really know. But the big difference this year is that of those double haters, the people that really don't seem to like either Donald Trump or Joe Biden, they're overwhelmingly supporting Joe Biden right now. That's a big problem for Donald Trump. So in those past years, Matt, where you've had these competing forces, and often with things like voter ID laws, purging voter enrollments in various states, they've tended to be a bit of a wash. In the end, you know, people on one side will hear, well, they're trying to stop our folks voting, so they make sure more and more go out to vote, and they kind of cancel each other out. But we've never done this in a pandemic before. It really wasn't an issue in the election of 1920. Basically, the Spanish flu pandemic, so-called, was no longer a consideration when it came to that election. So we are in uncharted waters here. But the big problem for Trump, of course, is he's made people concerned about the safety, the democratic safety rather than the physical safety of voting by mail. But traditionally, it's older white voters, i.e. Trump voters, who do vote by mail. So if he's demotivating them and then they get scared at the last minute because they don't want to vote in person because there's a spike in infections in their part of Florida or Texas or Georgia, he could be in big trouble. If you know, again, if we're talking about 78,000 votes, you can make a big difference on election day. If it rains, it can make a difference. If there's a spike in COVID infections in the weeks leading up to November 3rd, which there could very well be as the weather gets colder and schools go back and so on, this could be a big problem for him too.
So before we go on to Q&A, I was going to ask Ali, with respects to the election, is there a relationship between the media, and this is obviously very high profile, and I think we've got a cool diagram to put up here as well, the media's impact on the election, if you wanted to address that, please?
Sure, I'd love to, because as I've been listening, it has struck me that our partisan and very polarized media system plays a tremendous role here. Because he is unpopular. You are absolutely right. And he has never broken 50%, but he is incredibly popular with his base. And he has never actually dipped below 37.5%, I believe is the number. And that is because he has this very tight control over the news outlets within, or information outlets within the circle that is on this chart. And this right-wing media circle is very self-reinforcing, and it's specifically ideological. It is openly oppositional. And what they state their mission is not to find the truth and go out and do journalism and dig up stories, but it's to oppose the mainstream media. And in the case of one Fox News producer, said that their existence is to provide an antidote against the people who hate them, who hate their viewers. And if you look at the role of a journalist as to provide a counterpoint for information that is coming out about either Donald Trump himself or about the actions in Washington or about certain media outlets, it takes on this very aggressive, sort of combative role. And Donald Trump benefits from this tremendously. Fox News is exceptionally popular here. It was the #1 highest rated television channel for prime time, which is 8 to 11 in America, not just on cable and not just news. It was the #1 channel, period, for June and July. And so a significant number of Americans are getting their information from within this right-wing media circle, which means they're getting a really different story than what folks who are getting their news from outside the circle are getting. And so when you have this idea that it certainly is, COVID is a huge crisis around the world, but folks are being told in America that it is not real, that I've heard countless times that actually COVID's going to go away the day after the election because it is a Democratic plot in order to steal the election from Donald Trump. And you hear this about the questions about voting. You hear this about climate change. It is this alternate reality. And when you are playing with different sets of information and different facts, it's not as if you're coming at the same problem from two different directions. You don't believe in the problem at all. And it's that kind of disconnect that has proven to be unshakable and deeply problematic when trying to address the most important issues of the day, to include a global pandemic and climate change and racial justice and everything else that we're really, really wrestling with here.
I'm hoping there'll be a few more questions on that we can address in our Q&A session. There's one more, and I just wanted to return to something that Gorana said earlier about the role of the America First and what foreign policy looked like. And please correct me if I'm wrong, it seems to me that the last genuine foreign policy US election was probably 2004, which was in some ways a referendum on the Iraq War. What role do you think foreign policy might play in this election, if any?
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Matt, that foreign policy is not necessarily, unless the country is at war, something that's going to be at the forefront of voters' minds once they go out to vote. And even though, you know, Bill Clinton made "It's economy stupid" as a kind of famous slogan, what we see is actually the Trump's election was also a referendum on identity, not just on economic standing and well-being, though there are obviously ways that these are interrelated as well, in particular parts of the United States where it's quite crucial actually to consider the way that they have been kind of intersecting. You can't simply kind of brush off the impact that basically non-college educated whites in the Midwest have had on Donald Trump's election. But foreign policy, I don't think, apart from Trump's push to portray himself as this deal maker and someone who will not stand for United States being pushed around, as he's described basically what has been happening to the United States and saying that all these, you know, allies and other countries around the world are just exploiting the United States. Again, kind of echoing something that Ali was saying earlier as well, this kind of view of the world where basically, you know, the pie is fixed, and if someone else takes a greater amount of pie, leaves the less of the pie for yourself. I hope I'm not making anyone hungry at 6 p.m. with references to desserts. But anyway, it's this sort of view where basically he has tried to carve out the most pie for the United States, and this is how he's going to try to portray his foreign policy record, even though there's not much that he can actually present on that front in terms of what he's done. And obviously there's this great irony as well that basically Trump is essentially extricating the United States from various institutions that have actually benefited the United States. Like, you know, the WTO is now on its knees, and you know, United States actually won more cases in front of the appellate court of the WTO than it had lost, for instance, right? But now that body is completely defunct because the United States doesn't want to nominate or approve any judges in what is actually the only kind of mechanism that had any sort of enforcement power in the kind of global governance front. And may I just I had two fingers on everything that John was saying was absolutely right, and I would totally second it. And I don't think we can overstate the idea that Republican Party is essentially an anti-majoritarian party, and it's banking on everything it has on still maintaining just enough of the white voter turnout, which, you know, 2016, we've seen basically since we could say late 60s, early 70s, the share of white voters decreased as a share of overall voters. What Trump has managed to do is just make it kind of plateau. And this is what they will be banking on again. And he could actually lose Pennsylvania, and he could lose Michigan, and still if he wins Wisconsin, where most of the non-voters are still in that pool of white, non-college educated, and he could win the election. This would be enough for 270 votes, which is exactly what he needs, because Pennsylvania and Michigan combined have those 36 electoral college votes. So we can't overstate the way that actually the electoral college system, because I've seen some of the questions coming in, can you explain the US political system, the electoral?
Yeah, I saw that one too and was wondering who wanted to do the 2-minute version of the US political system.
And if we have time to plug units, I'm just teaching a postgrad unit on US politics. So if anyone wants to late enroll at Sydney Uni, I'm just kidding. But anyway, the Utah's event, so I'm sure that they have great US politics classes, but really this is, I think, at the core of any sort of, debates of what the election strategy is going to be. It's just going to be making sure that, he essentially and by he, Trump emulates 2016. He could even lose by more popular votes than he did in 2016. Some say by as much as 5 million votes. Imagine that for what the legitimacy of that sort of term would be, but he could emerge as electoral college winner. So not quite foreign policy, but there was the foreign policy prelude to this.
Sorry, your foreign policy point was really good too about American leadership, and I struggle with the sort of the muddle-headedness of complaining about, for example, Chinese influence in the World Health Organization, while simultaneously you start withdrawing funding and say that you're no longer going to be a member. You get influenced by being a member, and there's a sort of a muddle-headed logic to that. All right, we have some questions, as Gorana has already alluded to, so we will kick them off. And we have a question from James, and he's asking, as Trump supporters are far more likely to vote in person in November, what's the danger of Trump? Yeah, this is a good question. I've been mulling this one as well. What's the danger of the president declaring victory on election night and reiterating, according to James, his misinformed view that mail-in voting is largely fraudulent? We're having this set up in lots of ways, aren't we? This environment on which whatever happens, the validity of the election can be questioned. Ali, would you like to take this one, and then maybe John, you can add as well?
Sure. Not only are we frightened about the president claiming victory before all the votes are counted, or even challenging the validity of the vote, period. Congress, too, is apparently quite worried about that. And apparently, I think last week, the Democratic leadership in the House called in military leaders to ask, like, okay, what are the possible scenarios here that we should really be thinking about in terms of President Trump either claiming victory where there's little evidence, or claiming victory and not leaving. So that is being tended to. But the good news is that electioneering in the United States is regulated by state. And so each state has their own election system in place to make sure that votes are counted and that the voting is valid. And we can look back to 2016, when President Trump made the unsubstantiated and false claim that there were millions of fraudulent votes. At that point, we saw Republican attorneys general and voting officials from around the states saying that that's actually not true, because it's more than just fealty to President Trump, although that is very strong. It also is their own legitimacy that they have to protect. And so I don't think that there's going to be, even the most diehard Trump fan, any kind of election official from any state that's going to say, yes, there was fraudulent voting on my watch. And so I think that that's one place where the federal system that we have, the separation between the federal government and the state governments, actually is quite powerful. and important. So I think that's one good thing that we can comfort ourselves with.
John, do you get concerned about that environment in which the president is facilitating?
Yeah, look, it is definitely a concern. President Trump was already before the 2016 election. He was saying that it was being rigged, and then he turned around and won. So it was hard to maintain that it was rigged, but he did maintain that he would have won the popular vote had not there been widespread voter fraud, which is untrue, or that millions of illegal immigrants had voted, bumping up Hillary Clinton's score in the popular vote, which is also demonstrably untrue. Quick plug for the program. I will be spending 5 minutes on Wednesday night explaining the Electoral College, and it's probably more concise than I could provide for the people watching the webinar this evening. It is complicated, but it is also logical in a way, but it is anti-democratic in that an Electoral College vote, even though small states like Wyoming only get 3 Electoral College votes and big states like California get 55 Electoral College votes, those 3 Electoral College votes in Wyoming represent about 190,000 people. The 55 Electoral College votes in California represent closer to 800,000 people each. And so just as the Senate is also undemocratic, there are 2 senators from every American state, the Electoral College in itself is by design undemocratic in that it protects smaller states against bigger states. And it just so happens that those smaller states, those less populous states at this point in American history, are overwhelmingly Republican states rather than Democratic states, which is why Democrats keep winning the popular vote and losing the Electoral College. So there's a few things to consider there. What was the actual question that you asked though, Matt?
So the actual question I asked was, is there a danger of on election night of the president declaring victory, perhaps while there's been perhaps a hold-up in a scenario where there's a hold-up of mail-in ballots being counted? And again, I guess my fear, and I assume this is James's fear as well, that environment in which the president has suggested that the whole thing is fraudulent does create...
Yeah, for sure. I mean, look, we could be faced with Florida 2000 times about 12 in every battleground state. And Ali's right, there are mechanisms because these are state elections being conducted for the Electoral College. So it'll be a state attorney general who has to certify the results in Wisconsin rather than Trump just declaring victory in Wisconsin. That doesn't give him those Electoral College electors who will decide on the presidency. So look, if it's close, and particularly because there is a good chance that Trump could be doing much better on election day than he does a week after election day. I don't think there's a realistic chance that he manages to hold on to power. I do have faith in the Electoral College process and Congress to not allow that, but it will allow Trump to say, I was robbed. And what it will pave the way for, I think more realistically than somebody illegitimately staying in office, is it paves the way for Trump to run again for a second term in 2024, because of course he can do it. Grover Cleveland did it in the 1880s. You can serve 2 4-year terms, but they can be non-consecutive. So Trump won't be going away. If he is even forcibly removed from the Oval Office at midday on the 20th of January, he or maybe Don Trump Jr. will be preparing to run for the presidency in 2024. So those sort of joke trolling sort of memes online of Trump 2024, 2028, 2032, 2036, that's probably going to happen. But I don't think that Trump will actually be able to claim victory when if he hasn't won. But the closer it is, the messier it will get.
Ali, John has plugged his show. Gorana's plugging her units at USyd. Was there anything you would like to plug before we move on to the next questions?
University of Tasmania. It's a wonderful place, and I think everybody should apply and definitely watch all of your webinars because I hear they're very good.
Nice. When I asked earlier today, there are a couple of questions based on this. When I asked what perhaps the defining characteristic of the last 4 years has been, my sense was the absolute and complete takeover of the Republican Party by Donald Trump. Gorana, what does this mean and how has he done it, and does it matter?
So I'm gonna put the kind of professorial hat on and say that I'm more of a belief that there has always been a Trumpian stream in the Republican Party, going back, way back. And even when there wasn't a Republican Party, there has been this sort of nativist kind of current in American polity, but it wouldn't have been expressed, obviously, in the grand old party back in mid-19th century. However, if we go as far back as say 1950s, you see that there is a stream of the Eisenhower Republicans as well as McCarthyites, right? You see that the kind of bards of conservative thought, like Bill Buckley, for instance, were once upon a time racist and nativist, but then turned into these kind of traditional conservative poster boys. And then, obviously 60s, you see the kind of various variants of some of that kind of nativist, racist sentiment in basically everyone from Barry Goldwater to Richard Nixon, and then some of these sentiment being used and kind of instrumentalized even, in the kind of respectable, say, figureheads of the party, like George H.W. Bush and his campaign of '88. So it's nothing, I would say, that's particularly new. I would just say that probably Trump at this point in time seems really kind of a really weird sort of way of pendulum to swing so much to that other end of the spectrum after having had 8 years of the first African-American president. But mind you, this sort of sentiment within the Republican Party was already there when Sarah Palin was elected as the vice president, or when the Tea Party was allegedly, kind of grassroots organizing and campaigning against a big government while at the same time holding up these protest signs that were overtly racist and were backed up by some of the kind of key donors to the Republican Party. So to make it kind of the long story into a short, I wouldn't say that Trump is so much of a kind of hostile takeover of the Republican Party that came from absolutely nowhere. He's a strange sort of vessel of this sort of message. But what has been particularly striking in my mind, and again, as someone who is much more attuned to kind of foreign policy developments when it comes to just America in the world and American politics, is the way that for the first year or so of Trump presidency, he was under at least some sort of control of the establishment of the Republican Party. And that's why you get, General Mattis or Secretary Mattis as the Secretary of Defense, or you get the likes of Rex Tillerson and so on, H.R. McMaster as the National Security Advisor. But what we really see is what's really interesting is how some of these even more traditional conservatives who then turned Tea Partiers who now are complete Trump loyalists, and I'm talking about, say, about Secretary Pompeo, but basically the way in which Trump has managed to convince some of these old establishmentarian Republicans to come along. And I can't explain it by any other way than saying that this is pure political opportunism. Mitch McConnell has been kind of the key enabler, but also a bunch of others, the House leadership as well. And they are basically just sticking around because, as both of my co-panelists have so brilliantly identified it, President Trump has not lost his base, and they are banking on him basically delivering this base once again, and them potentially riding on those coattails in 2020. And that's what it is. We are seeing some shifts within the, if you take a look at the Republican primaries, there are some Trump candidates that haven't managed to get across the line, but equally, there are some really concerning developments. We touched on briefly on the influence of some of the conspiracy theories. So the fact that you have now QAnon candidates, the kind of continuation of the ludicrous Pizzagate conspiracy that has now basically transformed into this broader conspiracy about how Democrats and these ominous forces are basically controlling America, and how Donald Trump is the only one that can fix it. This is concerning, but again, the paranoid style in American politics is nothing new. Richard Hofstadter wrote a brilliant book on that, and some would say it could go back as far as the Declaration of Independence. So this was a mini lecture. Again, tune in for another class on US Politics 101.
John or Ali, did you? Yes, please, Ali, yeah.
Just tying both what John and Gorana just said together, the questioning of the legitimacy of this election, John's correct, like that is going to absolutely give Trump fuel for the fire to either he or his son run in 2024, which I think would make a lot of current Republicans who are his supporters heartstruck. Because right now it is that fight for which version of the Republican Party is going to pull ahead. Is it going to be the Trump version, or is it going to be, it certainly won't be the old establishment version, but will it be sort of a new hybrid that I think if you looked early in the Republican convention at Nikki Haley's speech, Tim Scott, these were all sort of dipping their toe into 2024 in the hopes that they have a clear path. And the only thing that would stand in their way is if a Trump runs against them, because they have just proven not only their fealty to him, but that they will support his brand, and the base is going to support his brand. And so I think that they really want he himself and maybe his son to move to the side so they can reel back to just a degree the kind of Trumpian politics that he is advocating. And if there is that, I was tossed out illegitimately and we got to go back and get him, then that fight between the factions of the Republican Party that's being fought out right now, that's still not going to be solved. It was supposed to be solved in 2016, and it was not, because Donald Trump came in and sort of took everything for himself. And so that Anderson fight within the GOP is going to be lasting, I'm afraid.
And
I'd just add to that. I think both Ali and Gorana are absolutely right in that Trump didn't come out of a clear blue sky. There was Sarah Palin, there was Michelle Bachmann and Herman Cain, there was populism and nativism as a part of that sort of Tea Party reaction to both Obama, and also in reaction to the perceived failure of America's wars and the global financial crisis. So there are a number of things that obviously throughout history, those elements have added up towards extremities in to the left and the right historically. And I think Ali's also very, very spot on when she talks about the what's next question, because a lot of Republicans are looking at the polls, and even though they may say, well, Trump was in this position in 2016, they can't exactly expect to have that same extraordinary confluence of events that conspired against Hillary Clinton, including Russia and WikiLeaks, including James Comey, including her historically high unfavourables. She was always above 40% negatives, the only ever nominee to start from that point. That's why she lost out to Obama in 2008. It's why she almost lost to Bernie Sanders in 2016 in the primaries. Hillary Clinton was always polarizing. So whether Donald Trump can patch something together now or not, they're already thinking, well, if he loses, okay, we need to decide where the party goes as of the 21st of January next year. And even if he wins, a second-term president is pretty much a lame duck from the midterms onwards. You've got, a big field, including Nikki Haley, Mike Pompeo, Tim Scott, maybe Tom Cotton, as one of these candidates who is trying to tap into that Trump base while also keeping a foot in the establishment Republican camp. Some conservatives, including people like Matt Schlapp from the American Conservative Union, feel as though actually they're not going to go back to even regular political channels. There will be more, if not reality TV stars, certainly people that are as famous for their achievements in business as they are having been in the Senate or a governor. So that is going to be fascinating to see, because just as Ronald Reagan was a charismatic vessel for conservative values in the 80s, and he obviously believed in a lot of those conservative values himself, even though he was a former Democrat and a former unionist, his worldview was sort of consolidated behind anti-communism. Donald Trump, completely empty vessel, lacking in any ideological undergirding at all, but somebody who tapped into the anger of the electorate rather than their belief structures. So what happens next? That tells us so much about the future of politics, not just in the United States, but around the world. So watch this space in that post-Trump era. Do they go for a Trump clone, literally, or just another term of Trump? Or do they go for somebody like Nikki Haley, who represents what you referred to earlier, Matt, as the sort of the 2012 post-mortem, post-Romney, more diverse and inclusive Republican Party? I sense that it's probably going to be heading in that Nikki Haley direction, but I've been wrong every 4 years for really my entire adult life. So I don't know why I'd be right this time either.
I think for me, Ali, was what you said, and I agree with all three of you. It strikes me as the fealty to the president is something that is unique in this respect. And one of our colleagues, Lance Bailey, sort of made the analogy of a mob boss in some respects, of sort of the metaphorical kissing of the ring. Does seem slightly different.
It is, and that's a really good. Lance has a really good analogy there. Gorana said that that he is built on this white identity politics, and that's totally true. I feel like he has unleashed in the American public something that had been really tamped down. Certainly, he has unleashed it within the Republican Party, because that tendency, playing footsie with extremists and white nationalists, that's always been there. But the Republican Party has always said, we don't want any part of it, with a little bit of a wink. We're not going to overtly agree with you, but we sure want you to vote for us. And that has just built and built until President Trump unleashed that and said, and it's starting in the campaign, getting straight through to Charlottesville, that it's okay, that there were good people on both sides. And so it is that, it is the validation that they have and the recognition that there are a lot of Americans who feel this way. And there are so many Americans that feel this way, that there's that base is a very safe vote. The media system that we have that really kind of provides a very tight narrative allows the fealty to the president to not only continue, but it's a feedback loop now. So he will say something and they will repeat it to him, and maybe like a slightly tweaked form, and then he'll repeat that. So they're all on message together. And the combination of all of these things really means that he has a very tight control over, between, I guess it's like around 40-something% of the electorate. And it is that devotion and his ability, we keep going back to Shameless, his ability to take great pride in the fact that he's showing the other side what for, which is kind of that mob boss mentality. And without using the actual word, I will just tell you that I saw with my daughter a bumper sticker around here the other day that said, Trump 2020, F your feelings. And I thought there has never been a more perfectly distilled idea of what Trumpism is, because it's not about an idea. It's not an ideology, as John said. It's not a policy. It really is just, I'm going to show the libs. I'm going to show the other side, F your feelings. And that's not a great way to lead a country or act in the world. And it certainly is not representative of an entire nation of people. But that's where we are right now. And that keeps getting reaffirmed. And the more that is reaffirmed, then the tighter his control is over that segment of the population.
There's been so much of that, sorry to interrupt, but there's been so much of that at the RNC actually in terms of the culture wars. And I don't know if you noticed, basically the media, the attacks, so the mainstream media that has basically done so much to attack President Trump, and he was basically portrayed as this victim kind of, kind of a grass leaf in the wind that has been constantly battered by these kind of forces of the media, as if he wasn't throwing, out a lot of these things on a kind of hourly basis via Twitter and all the rest. And so then it's plays into this idea of culture wars, and what Vice President Pence called that basically America's identity is here at stake. Basically, the idea that there is something that's under attack, and that plays into some of the kind of framing that we've seen on Fox in particular, that essentially, you know, from war on Christmas to war on all these things that are kind of shorthands for white middle Americans, so to speak, right? And that this is something that President Trump is basically trying to prevent from further going on, and the other side is basically to blame. And yeah, so a lot of the kind of backlash against PC culture, and I mean, it was kind of interesting to see the amount of time that was dedicated to those sort of issues, you know, when I'm not sure that probably an average Trump voter would be so consumed with kind of the idea of cancel culture, but it was still there, and it was talked about quite a lot, which was certainly interesting to see.
I'm going to get abusive emails if we don't do more than 3 questions from the Q&A that we have this evening. Frank Frost has asked a really interesting question. I like this question because it's relates to something we haven't spoken about, but this year's also a census year in the US as well. So the elections have special importance with respects to Frank's question on the prospects of US electoral reform. So combating gerrymandering, and especially talk about Wisconsin, and possibly voter suppression practices. Now, I haven't followed this closely enough in either of the platforms and whether any of the candidates are talking about the possibilities of electoral reform. So have any of our panelists sort of identified the possibilities of electoral reform in the US?
Well, John, do you want to jump in and I'll...
Sure. Just to say that, I mean, whether it's campaign finance reform or electoral reform around gerrymandering, or even around reenfranchising former felons and so on, these issues tend to be on the periphery. They don't motivate people who are not affected by them. And they don't necessarily motivate politicians who are elected by a system that is as it is now. So there's not a huge kind of motivation to change the system. A lot of the expanding of the franchise or making more democratic the congressional districts in the United States tend to benefit the Democratic Party rather than the Republican Party. So Democrats like to do these things, but they often try not to make a huge deal about it. So Joe Biden is not necessarily going to campaign on this. That being said, both Eric Holder, Obama's former Attorney General, and President Obama himself are both involved in fairly significant programs aimed at the redistricting that will happen at the state level as a result of the 2020 census. And so focusing very much on the state races that are coming up, as well as the Senate races. But all of these issues, I think, probably fade a little bit into insignificance in the face of the other external motivator. At the moment, Republicans thinking, well, there's a reasonable chance Trump could lose, but we don't want to lose the Senate with him, that's for sure. And maybe if we can possibly, drag him over the line for 4 more years, well, that'll be good for the Supreme Court as well, because Ruth Bader Ginsburg will be in her 90s by the time the Democrats will have another shot at the White House and appointing a Supreme Court justice. So they've already had a payback big time from Neil Gorsuch and Brett Kavanaugh being appointed in the last 4 years. So those are the kind of external considerations that I think are going to be a bigger motivator for more voters, personally, than issues such as redistricting and even extending the franchise and so on.
Adding on to that, that's all correct. It's another indication of how having someone in charge really does affect the rules and the mechanisms of government and governing, because this is a census year and the director of the census shortened data collection by 4 weeks. And in doing so, those 4 weeks are valuable in finding people who are difficult to count. And that really weighs more heavily on particularly people in cities who are working 2 jobs at a time. So a lot of poor people, It also influences, of course, people who are concerned about the government coming to their house and asking them a whole lot of questions, which could be citizens of all stripes. And so the fact that that has happened and there's very little outcry, because I think there's very little understanding of the significance of this, we're going to see the after effects of that. And that is going to affect then how many people are counted in the future, redistricting, and how many Americans are going to be disenfranchised as a result of this. And so it's one more data point of how important it is. The job of the president as the leader of the bureaucracy is really big. We can pay attention to his tweets all we want because they're more salacious and they are easier to talk about. But the decimation of the bureaucratic state, we're going to be feeling the after effects of that for a very long time.
We've also got a question, and I guess we've sort of skirted around this a little bit, but someone's asking what the combination of COVID-19 and the BLM movement protests, how they will impact the election at the moment. And you probably all saw Kellyanne Conway's comments with respects to, and I'm praising here that ongoing violence in some ways is beneficial to the Trump campaign. Is there a particular way that this plays? And I guess do Democrats have to be careful, especially with respects to suburban voters, on finding a way to be both supportive of Black Lives Matter, but also to also not allow the Trump administration to run a law and order campaign?
Maybe just quickly, we first have to understand that most of the protests that have taken place as part of the Black Lives Matter collectively protests that have been going on since the killing of George Floyd have been overwhelmingly non-violent. So I think that we can't stress this enough. And this is now cutting into some of Ali's grass here with the, the media portrayal, and what's been basically covered have been these instances of what have been portrayed as riots or, violent protests that often were provoked or often had even groups that aren't part of the movement come in and do that. And obviously we are now seeing what's happening in the wake of the shooting of Jacob Blake in Kenosha, Wisconsin. And I think that particular question, because we were talking about the importance of Electoral College and the fact that this is happening in Wisconsin could actually be quite significant. So the particular latest round of protests in maybe convincing some of the unconvinced or those that haven't actually gone out to vote in 2016. But at the same time, the impact we've seen around the world, how much the pandemic has basically been used as a catalyst and an amplifier of some of the resistance movements. And it's not just in the United States that we have seen protests to actually challenge the governments, especially those with more authoritarian streaks. So you can take a look at what's been happening, for instance, in Belarus as of late, right? So there is this kind of spring of citizen activism that has emerged, even though we should all arguably be practicing physical and social distancing, but the fact that the pandemic has just amplified what's wrong in a lot of these societies, because it has exacerbated, obviously, both economic problems, but also it has shown light on the inequalities in terms of, different minorities actually suffering to a much greater extent, that actually this could be used as, again, as a mobilizational tool for the Democrats. But again, there are so many moving pieces. There's so much that we don't know, and just the kind of, we have to remember that the electoral day is actually just the last day to vote. So people can start voting in the United States as early as in 2 weeks' time, right? Correct me if I'm wrong. I think Michigan is the first one to start releasing their mail-in ballots. So a lot of things can also happen in this lead up to 3rd of November.
Mm-hmm.
Did anyone else want to sort of comment on that? How we sort of find a balance with these two sort of events that are happening simultaneously at the moment?
I would just chime in that,
go ahead.
Go ahead. I would just chime in that, Gorana, while you're right that that the majority of the BLM protests have been peaceful and COVID is really, really huge as an issue and a problem and a concern, it's not really perceived that way through the right-wing media outlets. It's not a problem on Fox News. COVID's not an issue on Fox News. They don't talk about it. And the vast majority on the Fox News depiction, the vast majority of protests are riots and looters and violence that's going to spread to the suburbs. So it's, again, two separate realities. John, sorry.
Yeah, and I agree with that. And just to say, and as a media practitioner myself, I'm very aware of the fact that whether it's a protest or a riot or a bushfire, cameras focus in on the flames and the smoke. They don't show the every other part of the city and the state that is just fine. So anybody behaving in a violent fashion, shouting, screaming, anybody with any kind of underlying psychological issue that has them being drawn towards a crowd, and maybe ultimately in the case of one young man last week opening fire on protesters, killing two by shooting them because a 17-year-old boy decided that he was in charge of defending a gas station. And ridiculous things happen, and the media, having their Klieg lights and their cameras on it, tend to inflame the situation. And obviously sections of the media are doing that, and now the President of the United States is doing that. So it is a tinderbox, and as Kellyanne Conway said the quiet bit out loud, it definitely helps the president's attempts at a Nixonian 1968 law and order campaign in the face of a civil rights protest.
I know we're coming up. In fact, we've just drifted past our advertised end time, but if our panelists don't mind, we might ask a couple more questions that are on here. I feel that a lot of the questions here that we've addressed in some respects to varying degrees that are there already, but there are a couple there that I really did want to address. One was, what will the role of young voters be in this election? If someone would want to address that, please.
I can. Historically, young voters are excited, enthusiastic, and vote about 15% less than the rest of the voting eligible public. So at kind of the high water mark in, I think it was 2008, just about 50% of 18 to 29-year-olds voted. And that was the high water mark. So there's a lot, every election, it's like, fingers crossed, you guys will go out and do it this time. And there is the perception, I think, among many young people that their vote doesn't count. That in 2016 may have been dispelled a little bit, but then 2018 came around and those voting rates dropped again. So the hope is that young people vote. I always want young people to vote, but in numbers, they really don't in the United States as much as the rest of the voting eligible public, which is too bad.
Yeah, Democrats since George McGovern, and which was the first election, 72, when 18-year-olds could vote, were convinced that they'd have this youthful army of progressives come out and vote for them. And Ali's right, they don't tend to at any significant rate. Obama did broaden the electorate and expand it to younger people, but it's hard to see a 77-year-old white guy like Joe Biden doing that. Kamala Harris didn't show that she had any great appeal to young progressives in particular. Whether they're motivated enough by their hatred of Trump to come out and vote, we'll just have to wait and see. It could also be, of course, even though they may not vote in greater numbers, they may end up representing a greater proportion of the overall vote, because younger people, less likely to be severely affected by COVID, may in fact, what was 45% turnout in 2016 may become 50% again, purely because a lot of people over the age of 65 don't end up voting.
Does Bernie Sanders' pace with the party make any difference, do you think, to young turnout and the coalition that he was able to gather in 2016?
Certainly the fact that the Sanders wing of the Democratic Party giving a full-throated Biden support and endorsement at the convention, I think that was notable. But I think that there's that enthusiasm gap, right? I mean, because the person that maybe younger voters wanted to vote for is not at the top of the ticket or even second on the ticket. That may be a determining factor all of its own. But the fact that there isn't that sort of, that hostility that there was in 2016 between the Sanders camp and the Clinton camp, that certainly will allow more people to vote, I think, with greater ease. But if that excitement is not necessarily there.
12% of Bernie Sanders voters in 2016, primary voters, voted for Donald Trump. It's hard to see 12% of Bernie Sanders supporters this year voting for Donald Trump. I suspect they'll stay at home. They're not excited by Howie Hawkins in the way they were by the Greens candidate Jill Stein. Maybe that's a gender thing, or maybe there's something else going on there. So yeah, it's hard to see them being a big factor.
And the last question that I wanted to ask is one for all of you, and I'm going to disappoint everyone on the Q&A by not getting a prediction from you, because I thought the same too. Yeah, that was I'm a little bit like John. I think since the Brexit referendum, I'm 0 from 3, I think, for predictions on various elections. The role of social media. There's obviously been a lot of noise, especially around Mark Zuckerberg and Facebook. Twitter has started proactively deleting tweets that they regard. What is the role of social media in the 2020 election?
Well, it's nice that some of the social media executives have recognized, as you mentioned, Twitter, for instance, that they actually can put them on the scale. At the same time, we have to remember that none of these platforms are real life, but certainly, especially Twitter, which tends to kind of be kind of skewed in terms of the representation of general public. So you see a lot of these Twitter wars going on, but they don't necessarily represent who is out there. But I think one notable thing is certainly the fact that Facebook is not quite budging and is still treating the political messaging in a way that, would conform to just kind of general principles of free speech. There might have been some movements, but not in a way that, say, we've seen from Twitter, where they're open about the kind of curation. And this is significant, obviously, because Facebook obviously has way more users than Twitter does, and the fact that it has been much more able in creating these echo chambers. Not that Twitter is not guilty of that, but the fact that you can just exist in your own kind of ecosystem in a chamber that reaffirms your beliefs, and what's more, kind of amplifies them and makes you more enraged, if you want to kind of go full circle on some of the things that we've been talking about just an hour and a half ago. And in that way, we can't understate its influence. And this is why, obviously, President Trump has been on social media so much, and campaigns have relied on it.
I would just briefly add on that, and I say this as somebody who spent 3 years working as a fact checker for the ABC as well. It's a bit of a problem when, whether it's Twitter or Facebook, start fact checking and then policing the president and others, because as soon as you don't take something down, as soon as you don't block a tweet, you are in effect endorsing it. You're saying, oh, this is okay. So this inflammatory thing that Donald Trump has said, yeah, it wasn't quite bad enough to take it down. So there's the new normal. That's the standard that you walk past and allow. So I'm not entirely comfortable with it. And it's also, the bigger issue is that it is a literal fire hose of false and misleading information out there on social media. And nobody can hope to police it. Yes, you knock the extremes off perhaps, but there's an awful lot of pretty terrible stuff out there that'll keep circulating. And now there's maybe, it's just been burnished. Maybe it's true because it's still, nobody's taken it down.
True. And I think all of that together is really sort of the power and the fear that I have about social media, because it does allow us to stay in our filter bubbles. It spreads information and misinformation so quickly now, and it flattens expertise, and it allows everybody to have an opinion about things that people really are not equipped to have an opinion about. And I don't mean in terms of political stuff, I mean in terms of medical stuff, that we really are seeing just the expansion of misinformation and disinformation that is moving around so quickly. It is very, very hard to try and combat that with facts and with science when those things are being demonized elsewhere. So it's really tricky. It's difficult.
I could continue this conversation with you guys for at least another hour. There are so many things we haven't discussed. We haven't looked at House races. We haven't looked at the Senate. But we do have time constraints. Before I thank our panel tonight, it's important for me to thank the co-sponsor of this evening's event, the AIIA Tasmania branch. Also thank the University of Tasmania's wonderful events team for putting together tonight's event. Thank you, John Barron, Gorana, Grgic, and Alison Dagnes, especially Alison Dagnes for getting up at 2:30 in the morning, Pennsylvania time. Thank you also very much for an engaging, informative discussion. Thank you to our audience this evening as well. I should remind you that this will be uploaded onto YouTube and to various other sites available via the University of Tasmania's website. And as you can see from our ad there, the series does continue with other public lectures, and I encourage you to have a look at what's coming up. So again, thank you for taking part in this event this evening, and I wish you all a very good evening. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.